I want to look at two examples where the Apostle Paul used a word that he only used one time. Now, he wrote, as you guys know, 2/3 of the New Testament. And there's a couple of examples I want to look at where he used a word that he only used one time. And both examples, I think, are encouragements for us that we can live at a level in this life higher than the world lives. And that's good news, isn't it? Now, you guys have heard me say before, and I really believe this, that when God saved us, which I'm thankful that he did, when he saved us, he didn't save us just for the reason of taking us to heaven. There's much more to this whole thing than just heaven. Now, heaven is wonderful, and I'm glad we get to spend eternity with the Lord, but there's more to what we're doing than just getting saved and waiting for him to come get us or our life to end, whichever happens first. But one thing that I've kind of jokingly said before about the Lord saving us is that if his only plan was to save us and take us straight to heaven, he just need 2 evangelists, one to get us saved, one to kill us. But because that's not what he did, there's a purpose he has for us in this life right now. And I want to discuss a little bit this morning about that purpose. And again, look at a couple of examples where the Apostle Paul almost had to, in one case, make up a word to describe the life God's called us to live. And we're going to look at these examples as we go today. But again, we're not called just to get saved and just bide our time until he comes back or until we pass away. There's a life we're called to live, and I think, sadly, most people never really walk in the fullness of it. Now, I intend to, if the Lord does not come back sooner, I intend to live to be about 110. I really do. I'm not sure why I picked 110 versus 109, but I picked 110. I want to live at least that long if we're still here. And I'm not sure how much time we have left. We may have that long, we may not. If we do, I want to live this life, even though heaven's going to be wonderful. And part of me, hey, if he came back now, I'm not going to argue with him and say, no, I'm not ready to go yet. I'll be ready to go. But I want to live this life as long as I'm here. And when I do leave here, and I do go to be with him for eternity, I want to take as many people with me as I can. And I want to have a long list of victories behind me. I don't want to get there and be like, man, I had one shot of that thing, and I just kind of went from defeat to defeat to defeat. And at least I get heaven, but look at the times I didn't capitalize upon the authority and the life he made available to me. I don't want that to be what I think about myself when I get to heaven. So let's start looking here in Ephesians chapter 2. Look at a handful of scriptures. And I asked the media team, which, by the way, let's give those guys a big hand back there. I see Miss Tiana back there. And I see that Bailey boy back there. Good to see you, sir. How you doing? Doing great. Now, I asked those guys to use the New King James Version, which is what we usually do. But I'm going to read it this morning out of the Amplified. And I think it'd be good to kind of see both versions. And I rarely ever preach from the Amplified, but today I felt like these verses, this translation does a really good job. I think probably the best job in these cases of bringing out what the original text was saying. So in Ephesians 2, we'll start at verse 4 and read down a handful of verses. Now, Paul's describing here the life that we're called to live. And most of what we're going to look at today are things that Paul said. And Paul lived this life at a level that I don't think many have ever attained. And even he himself said towards the end of his life that he had not attained yet. And we're going to look at that as we go. But in Ephesians chapter 2, let's look at what Paul describes as the reality for us right now. Now, we sang that song about no matter what I feel, no matter what and I forget the exact lyrics, but no matter what I feel and think, that's not necessarily reality. It's kind of what that's talking about. Let's look here. Ephesians 2, verse 4. But God, so rich is he in his mercy, because of and in order to satisfy the great and wonderful and intense love with which he loved us. Intense love, it says right there. I saw a video this week. It was so sad for the person talking. It was one of the modern-day Pharisees talking about how we shouldn't have love songs about Jesus and that kind of stuff. It should be real just straight. I'm like, whatever, dude. You think that, and it is sad because you think that because you never have experienced it. You have never really experienced the love of Jesus if you think it's this straight, contained, in a tight little box thing. There's nothing we can do in this life to contain the love of Jesus. We cannot define the love of Jesus in human words. I had a very special encounter with Jesus last year, and I'll tell you something. He's sappy. He really is. And that's not easy for me to say. I'm kind of a, I'm not a real emotional guy. At least don't come across that way. But Jesus, I can tell you from personal experience, is sappy. And so if we're going to be straight and kept in a box, we're depriving ourselves of the fullness of his love. So again, sad for that guy because he's really missing out. So, but God, so rich as he is in mercy and his intense love with which he loved us, even when we were dead, slain by our own shortcomings and trespasses, he made us alive together in fellowship and in union with Christ. He gave us the very life of Christ himself, the same new life with which he quickened him, for it is by grace, which is his favor and mercy, which you did not deserve, that you were saved. And being saved means delivered from judgment and made partakers of Christ's salvation. Then verse 6, and he raised us up together with him and made us sit down together, giving us joint seating with him. And this, again, this is present tense. This is not just one day when we get to heaven. This is right now. So we know that Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father right now. Seated is the Wilkes County version. Seated, Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father right now. And these verses tell us that we are right there with him. That is the reality that we are able to experience right now, is we are seated, raised up with Christ, seated with him in heavenly places. That's reality. It says, yes, sir, in the heavenly sphere, by virtue of our being in Christ Jesus, the Messiah, the Anointed One, he did this that he might clearly demonstrate through the ages to come. Now that's one day. He's going to demonstrate one day what we're doing right now. He did this that he might clearly demonstrate through the ages to come the immeasurable, there it is, we can't put it in a little tiny box, the immeasurable, limitless, surpassing riches of his free grace, his unmerited favor, and his kindness and goodness of heart toward us in Christ Jesus. That sounds pretty fierce and intense to me. For it is by free grace, God's unmerited favor, that you were saved, delivered from judgment and made partakers of Christ's salvation through your faith. And this salvation is not of yourselves, of your own doing. It came not through your own striving, which is good news, but it is the gift of God. Let's go 2 more verses here. Not because of works, not the fulfillment of the law's demands, lest any man should boast. It is not the result of what anyone can possibly do, so no one can pride himself in it or take glory in himself. For we are God's own handiwork, his workmanship, recreated in Christ Jesus, born anew, that we may do those good works which God predestined, planned beforehand for us, taking paths which he prepared ahead of time, that we should walk in them, living the good life which he prearranged and made ready for us to live. That's a mouthful. Did you guys get all that? That's why I don't memorize much in the Amplified. I can get 3 or 4 verses in the New King James for every one in the Amplified. But those words there, the English language, again, it falls short. It's inadequate to describe what Paul was really saying. So even though we took all those words and we kind of get a glimpse, it still falls short of what Paul was really trying to express. God's goodness, God's love, the great riches he's made available to us, the life he's made available for us to live. It takes that many words just to begin to scratch the surface of what it's all about. But see, we're here right now, before we get to heaven, before we get to the ages to come, we're living this life right now. At least we can live this life right now that he prepared beforehand for us to walk in. It says we are his workmanship. And again, the Amplified says his handiwork. And some versions say we are his stroke of genius. That's pretty cool. So that's the life that God has called us to live. Let's turn and look together, or you can look on the screen if you want to, at Romans 8:37. And I've quoted this verse here many, many times. And I have been studying this verse off and on for a while. And this is a time when the Apostle Paul made up a word, had to make up a word. Now, this reminds me of my friend Greg Brady over here. Now, you guys know Greg Brady, our piano player. Now, what is that hat, by the way? Is that like a Strickland propane hat? Now, one time, Greg, He knows what that was all about. Sorry, that was low. Greg and I went camping together. This was, I guess, last year before. This beautiful spot, and there was a beautiful, beautiful creek. Now, I'm only a fraction of the level of coolness that Greg is. I've often said if I could be just half as cool as he is. Now, he was looking at this creek, and it was an example of where words just aren't enough. We're looking at this creek. Our campsite's behind us. He had just made me this wonderful Anchor coffee over the campfire. It was great. And he looks at this creek. He goes, dude, this is epic. This is epic. So now that word was not necessarily intended for that kind of application, but because Greg is cutting edge, he's on the very cusp of what's cool. See, I never would have thought epic. I said, this creek's really cool. I was the English version. Greg was the Greek version. He said, this is epic. So, he took a word, that was the only word he could think of that somehow, to some degree, defined how pretty that creek was. Well, now, the Apostle Paul in Romans 8:37 actually had a Greg Brady moment. He was thinking about the life that we're called to live, and there was no word that could come to mind that was big enough to explain the life we're called to live, to explain and describe the kind of people we're called to be. Now, the New King James Version says this, yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. And that sounds really good, but again, that's English, and that falls short. Because right there where it says more than conquerors, the Apostle Paul, who, by the way, was one of the most educated men of his day, he had trained under one of the preeminent Pharisees and teachers of the word of his day, and very, very intelligent man apart from all of that, not to mention his knowledge of the word. He had to make up a word here. He said, you guys know Nike tennis shoes and like Nike sports apparel. Well, that word Nike comes from this Greek word. Nike means conqueror or to conquer. Well, so he said, we are Hooper Nike, or Hooper Nikaio, I think is actually how you say it. So he says Hooper, which is where we get the English word hyper. Hyper means in excess. If we have a child that you say that child is hyperactive, it means that child is more active than it normally would be. There is an excess amount of activity in that child's life. Or if you have like a hyperactive thyroid or hyperactive something in your body, it is busier, it's producing more than what your body needs that organ to produce. It's over and above. So that word Hooper Nikaio, which we are, and I probably said that wrongly, but more than conquerors, he had to make up a word that says, and let me read to you what it really means. Now, Hooper again means hyper. Nikaio means conqueror. So we're hyper conquerors. So literally, I wrote this down this morning, word for word from the Greek text. It says, or a Greek explanation, a super conqueror who is completely and overwhelmingly victorious. A super conqueror who is completely and overwhelmingly victorious. It means it means to vanquish beyond, to prevail completely, and to gain a decisive victory. Now that's very encouraging. No matter what we're going through, no matter how tough this season is, whether it's a sickness, whether it's a relationship issue, whether it's a job issue, no matter what it is, that is the life we're called to live, is to be a super conqueror who is completely and overwhelmingly victorious. We can vanquish beyond, prevail completely, gain a decisive victory. That's the life we're called to live. I didn't get saved to wait for heaven. I got saved to live that life right there. Jesus saved us and called us to live that life right there. A super conqueror. Brother, how's it going? Well, I'm hanging in there. Well, I'm glad you are. That's good. We're called to more than just hanging in there. Now, there's sometimes I feel like I'm just hanging in there. I may really feel that way. In my personal emotions and the way I kind of size myself up and the way I understand reality in this natural sense, maybe I am just hanging in there, but I can't let that define my true reality, which is I'm a Hooper Nikaio. I am a hyper conqueror. I'm a super conqueror. You are a super conqueror. So, these little hymns that we sing where we're just kind of hanging on, waiting for glory. Glory is what is right now. Heaven will be more glorious than we can ever imagine on this earth. That is not the glory God's talking about. The glory we're called to walk in is we're called to walk in and experience it right now while we're still in the flesh. Now, let's keep that thought in mind. Let's turn together to Philippians chapter 3. Philippians 3, and we're going to save some time to worship some more at the end. I thought worship was great this morning. I really appreciate this team. These guys and gals do a lot every week. My wife was singing this morning. We have a deal. She'll sing and I'll preach. Or she can preach and I still won't sing. So, now Philippians, again, this is one of Paul's letters. Paul wrote about 2/3 of the New Testament. And Philippians, most scholars believe he wrote this close to the end of his life. Now, the Apostle Paul probably walked in this hyper-conqueror level as much as anybody we know outside of Jesus. But even though he did, let's look at some things he says about himself here. Now, this again is close to the end of his life. He was in prison when he wrote this. He had been on trial already. He had been going through all these things that were leading ultimately to his being martyred for the sake of the gospel. And here he is, close to the end of his life, writing this letter to the church of Philippi, and he says these things about himself. Let's look in verse 8, read down a few verses here. And again, this will be New King James. This will be the Amplified. It adds a few words here. So Paul's talking about himself, and this is what he says. He says, "Yes, furthermore, I count everything as a loss compared to the possession of the priceless privilege, the overwhelming preciousness, the surpassing worth and supreme advantage of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord and of progressively becoming more deeply and intimately acquainted with Him, of perceiving and recognizing and understanding Him more fully and clearly. For His sake I have lost everything, and I consider it all to be mere rubbish, refuse, and dregs, in order that I might win and gain Christ, the Anointed One, and that I may be actually found and known as in Him, not having any self-achieved righteousness that can be called my own, based on my obedience to the law's demands, which were ritualistic uprightness and supposed right standing with God, thus acquired, but possessing that genuine righteousness, which comes through faith in Christ, the Anointed One, the truly right standing with God, which comes from God by saving faith." Again, this is all present tense. This is all right now. And again, this is the Apostle Paul close to the end of his life. "For my determined purpose," in verse 10, "is that I may know Him, that I may progressively become more deeply and intimately acquainted with Him, perceiving and recognizing and understanding the wonders of His person more strongly and more clearly, and that I may in that same way come to know the power outflowing from His resurrection, which it exerts over believers, and that I may so share His sufferings as to be continually transformed in spirit into His likeness, even to His death, in the hope that if possible," we'll stop here at verse 11, "that if possible, I may attain to the spiritual and moral resurrection that lifts me out from among the dead, even while in my living body." So, New King James says, "if by any means I may attain to the resurrection from the dead." Now, again, that's a lot of words there. Now, let me share quickly as a little side note, and we'll come back to these verses. Almost a year ago, actually it was last July, I began to study Hebrews chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, which are the fundamental foundational doctrines of the Christian faith. One of those doctrines is the resurrection of the dead. That's the one I'm currently on. It's the 5th of the 6 doctrines. It's taken me this long to get number 5. I've been really going in depth studying these doctrines. And I've been studying the resurrection of the dead, which is what the Bible calls it. And I told my wife the other week, I said, I've been shocked how many times the resurrection is mentioned in the Bible. Now, I've been reading the Bible for over 30 years. And I was shocked when I really began to dig into it, how many times the resurrection is talked about. And I've been teaching the Bible on a fairly regular basis for almost 20 years. And I was shocked at how much the resurrection is talked about in the Bible. It was a central theme of every message you can find just about of the early apostles. A central theme, the resurrection. The Apostle Paul, when he was on trial at this time of his life, when he wrote Philippians, when he was on trial, he told them, I'm on trial because I talk about the resurrection. He said that. And how few times is it mentioned today in churches? It's our Easter message, but how many times do we mention it the rest of the year? I don't mean so much just here at Unified, but think about how many times do we really hear about it. If we do, at least in my experience, it becomes, to me, it's kind of become cliche. Yeah, Jesus died, he was buried, he was resurrected, we're going to go to heaven one day. The resurrection, yes, thankfully it gets us access to heaven one day. But let's look at something here real quickly. The resurrection of the dead. Now, in Philippians 3, go back if we could please, we'll read it up here now, verses 10 and 11 in Philippians 3. If you guys can find that, okay. Skip on down if we can. Can we skip down a few verses there? Okay, that's verse 10. Now, Paul's talking, and again, he's talking about what he is still wanting to have happen to him in this life, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection, there's that word resurrection, and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. Go down one more verse. If by any means I may attain to the resurrection from the dead. There's that word resurrection again. Now, our English language, resurrection in verse 10, resurrection in verse 11. In the original text, two different words were used. And the word that Paul used for resurrection right there, he only used it one time. The Bible just uses it one time total in the whole New Testament. So it's a different kind of resurrection than what verse 10 talks about. You're like, wait a minute now, and let me explain what it is. In verse 10 there, where it says, let's back up if we can, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection, that is Jesus' actual resurrection from the dead, the same word that was used to describe Lazarus' resurrection, Jairus' daughter's resurrection, to describe the resurrection that we will one day experience if we die before Jesus comes back. So if we die, we know that when he comes back, the dead in Christ will rise first. That is the resurrection that word is talking about. Actually being raised from the dead out of a grave. Now go to verse 11. This resurrection here has to do with the resurrection that we experience before we ever die. And again, that's the only time in the Bible that word's ever used. The only time it's ever used to describe the life that we're called to live now is a life of resurrection from the death that's in this world. That has nothing to do with us coming out of the grave one day. That is present tense right there. The other resurrection we're going to experience one day if we do die before Jesus comes back. That's in the future. Jesus had that resurrection 2,000 years ago, but we're called to have that resurrection right there today. That is a resurrection that has nothing to do with physically coming to life from being dead. It's a resurrection that talks about us being raised out of and made separate from the death in this world. The life, spiritual and moral death that's in this world. And let me read that again in the Amplified, just verse 11. That if possible, I may attain to the spiritual and moral resurrection that lifts me out from among the dead even while in the body. So Paul was saying, what I'm looking for, what I really want, is to walk in resurrection life, resurrection power while I am still living on this earth. Now again, Paul did that probably more than most people we know about. I mean, Jesus was the ultimate fulfillment of that, the embodiment of that. But the Apostle Paul, with all that he did to demonstrate for us that kind of a life, he still said, I'm still trying to get there. I don't feel like I've gotten there yet. So there was still more that even he wanted that he didn't feel like he had yet. So if he can say that, you and I, it's pretty safe to say we can say that. So this word speaks of a life that we're called to have right now, a life of resurrection power that separates us, makes us different and distinct from the world. We can't do things the way the world does and expect to see the kingdom of God. We can't do it. We've got to operate at the kingdom level, which is the life of Jesus is living and walking in resurrection power. Now, we had Easter recently, and I happened to catch a message by David Jeremiah on Jesus' resurrection. And this is something that he said. He said, we have the same power available to us to live the Christian life that God used to bring Jesus out of the grave. We have the same power available to us to live the Christian life, which means we become hyper-conquerors. The same power that God used to bring Jesus out of the grave is available to us right now to live our lives at a level most never walk in. So, how do we get there? I'm not sure. Dan, do you know? We'll get Dan to come explain to us. How do we get there? I have good news and I have bad news. Actually, they're both good news, but the good news is we can get there. The bad news is, in order to be resurrected, we got to die. And no one likes dying, especially when it means we're still alive when it happens. Now, none of us gets out of this world alive. We know that. But if we're going to walk in this resurrection power, we're not going to get that alive. Let me explain what I mean by that. And there's my daughter, Amelia. And she actually asked me a question yesterday. I want to tell you guys what she asked me. And it was Jesus talking right to me through her little lips. And I'll share that in just a minute. But let's look in 2 Timothy chapter 3. We'll begin to wind down with this here so we can save some time to worship. But in 2 Timothy chapter 3, again, this will be New King James. I'll read the Amplified, a few extra words here. And Paul's talking about the last days, which I believe we are in. I'm not sure where we are in the process, but I believe we are definitely closer now than we ever have been. So Paul is writing to Timothy here, and he's describing the times I believe we're in right now. This is what he says. But understand this, that in the last days will come set in perilous times of great stress and trouble, hard to deal with and hard to bear. Now, this isn't a doom and gloom message, by the way. But the next few verses tell us why the times are going to be that way. For people will be lovers of themselves and utterly self-centered, lovers of money, and aroused by an inordinate greedy desire for wealth. Does that sound like it's today? Proud and arrogant and contemptuous boasters. They will be abusive, blasphemous, scoffing, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, and profane. And the word profane there, some versions say, will consider nothing holy, nothing sacred anymore. And we're definitely there right now. They're trying to get crosses taken off churches in this country, believe it or not. So there's nothing sacred anymore. Then verse 3, they will be without natural human affection. They'll be callous and inhuman, relentless, admitting of no truce or appeasement. The New American Standard says they will be irreconcilable. They will be slanderers, false accusers, troublemakers, intemperate and loose in morals and conduct, uncontrolled and fierce, haters of good. They will be treacherous, betrayers, rash, and inflated with self-conceit. They'll be lovers of sensual pleasures and vain amusements more than and rather than lovers of God. Now, we can see all those things happening. But let's look at verse 5. And this is the one I want to make personal for a second here, even though a lot of those describe me in one way or the other. Verse 5 says, for although they hold to a form of piety, true religion, they deny and reject and are strangers to the power of it. Their conduct belies the genuineness of their profession. Avoid all such people, turn away from them. So having a form of godliness, but denying its power, and from such people turn away. So it has this long list of 19 things, I counted 19 things of self-centeredness and greedy and lovers of money and all these things. And the last one it says is they will have a form of godliness, which I've got, by the way. I've got a form of godliness. I do. You guys do as well. I've got that. But then it says you can have that and deny the power of it. And that power right there is the resurrection power that Paul talked about in Philippians 3. The power to live this life differently than the world lives it. The power to live this life differently than a lot of Christians choose to live it. So it says, for although they hold a form of piety, true religion, they deny and reject and are strangers to the power of it. Their conduct belies the genuineness of their profession. Avoid all such people. Turn away from them. So They have a form of true godliness, which again, I've got that. So this could be me. This could be describing me because I've got a form of godliness, but it says they have denied its power. You study that word denied, it means they have said, nope, I want nothing to do with that. They say it's not real, it's not for today, or if it is, I want nothing to do with it. Resurrection power, which again means you have to die to get it. That's why we don't like it so much. We got to die to get there. Then it says, avoid such men as these. That means turn away from them, walk away. That means if I'm up here today not talking about resurrection power, walk out the door. Chris, sit down. No, I'm kidding. No, but Paul is saying that's how serious this is. If we have a form of godliness that is nice and neat, and you know, we dress up real nice and go sing our 3 hymns Sunday morning, we go home and nothing really happens in our lives, that's the kind of lifestyle we got to turn our back on. I'm not trying to be critical of anybody's church experience, but that's not the kind of church life God's called us to. Because church is not Sunday morning as much as it is Monday morning. And we can come here Sunday morning and it's easy to be saved here, but Monday morning we got to have that resurrection power. Amen. I can come in here this morning, we can sing songs and shake hands and everything feels wonderful, but tomorrow when the feeling has changed, my reality hasn't, my feeling has, my perspective of reality may have changed. Resurrection power will connect me to the true reality that I'm seated with Christ in heavenly places right now, called to live my life at a level the world doesn't walk at. And some Christians have chosen, this verse tells us, to say, no, I don't want that. I'm happy just to have my little packaged, neat box. Now, again, I said this is good news and bad news. The good news is we can get there. The bad news is we can't get there alive. Now, my daughter yesterday, I'll be a little bit transparent here. My wife and I, we had a little spat yesterday. My wife's very stubborn. And I don't make it sound like it's all her fault, but it was. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. We don't have many spats. We had a little spat, though, and Amelia wasn't even in the room, so she's not even fully aware of what was going on. And I walked out of our room and walked in the kitchen, and Amelia was there, and she had, I don't even know what it was. It might have been a cereal box. And there was like 2 lines had made a cross on that cereal box. She goes, look, Dad, this is what Jesus died on, and showed me the cross. Then she said to me, and she asked me, are we going to die on one too? And I thought to myself, yes, we are. I need to. I need to take up my cross. And it's not a physical death. If I'm ever going to have this resurrection life I'm talking about, this resurrection power that I'm talking about that Jesus wants me to have, I can't fight for my life. Didn't Jesus say, he who seeks to save his life will lose it, but he who loses it for my sake will find it? The more, and obviously our little spat, it's never just one person's fault. I was fighting for my rights. I was fighting for my life. I was fighting to make sure, I was, and you guys understand this. I was fighting to make sure that my point gets across. When Jesus said, if that's what you want, you can have that, but you're not going to have resurrection power. A lot of folks are content to stay at that level. They never become a hyper-conqueror. If we want to be a hyper-conqueror, it takes dying to ourselves. Let me read just a couple more verses. And if you guys want to go ahead and come up, the team, we can get ready to worship some more. So now this is what it means, just in a nutshell, to die. And again, this is not a physical death. This is dying to the things of this world so we can experience the life of Jesus. Experiencing the life that my daughter asked me, are we going to have? Jesus, through her, asked me, are we going to have that? Do you really want that? I do really want that. In Luke chapter 14, we look at verse 25. Luke 14:25, and it says, now huge crowds were going along with Jesus, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother in the sense of indifference to or relative disregard for them in comparison with his attitude toward God, and likewise his wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. So he's not saying you hate your family. He's saying the love you got to have for him is so big it dwarfs everything else. And he says, you cannot be my disciple if that's not true. Whoever does not persevere and carry his own cross and come after me, follow me, cannot be my disciple. Now, it's interesting that Jesus said cannot instead of may not. I remember being in school, and it was always funny when somebody had to go to the bathroom real bad. They'd say, teacher, can I go to the bathroom? And she would say, well, I'm sure you can, but what should you be asking me? May I go to the bathroom? Yes, you may. Go ahead. So may I means, do I have your permission to go to the bathroom? Can I means, is it physically possible? Can it actually happen? Do I possess the ability to do that? Well, I'm sure you do possess the ability to go to potty, but you'd ask me if I'm going to let you. Will you let me? Yes, go ahead. So Jesus didn't say, I'm not going to let you be my disciple if you don't take up your cross. He said, it is not possible. You do not possess the ability to be my disciple unless you are carrying your cross. And the cross is a place of death. The cross is a beautiful piece of jewelry today, but to them, that was like the electric chair. It'd be like us wearing an electric chair around our neck at that time, in that culture. That's what that was. That was execution. That was dying. And the last verse I'll read here is still in Luke chapter 9, verse 23. Kind of the same thing Jesus is saying here, but he puts in a very important word I want to close with. He says, and he said to all, if any person wills to come after me, let him deny himself, disown himself, forget, lose sight of himself and his own interests, refuse and give up himself, take up his cross daily, every day. Paul said, I die daily, and follow me. Cleave steadfastly to me, conform wholly to my example in living and, if need be, in dying also. So he says, if anyone wants to come after me, take up your cross, let him deny himself. That word deny is a bad word in our modern society. But if we don't deny ourselves, we're going to deprive ourselves of what God really has for us. We don't like the word deny anymore because deny means we got to say no to something that we want to say yes to. There's something that we want to say yes to that makes sense to us naturally, and Jesus says you can't have that and have me too. You can't have that and have this resurrection life I'm talking about at the same time. You can't have both. You have to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Again, not because he says, I'm not going to let you do it. It's because it will not work. You cannot be faithful to two masters that way. We have to deny ourselves, take up our cross. So I believe, and this is only, I'm sure, a partial answer to the question, how do we get there? How do we get to the place of walking in resurrection life and experiencing resurrection power, experiencing the life of Christ that he's called us to live? We have to die to ourselves. We cannot be resurrected as long as we're clinging to our life. We got to lay it down. That's the way it works.